I'm a wildlife researcher that studies the effects of climate change on animal habitats. One summer, I went on a research vessel to the Antarctic with the goal of measuring changes to penguin habitat. We left from Argentina following an icebreaker ship, but we didn't hit much ice until we were 30 hours into the voyage. The sky was gray, with thick dark clouds hanging over the horizon. The winds were calm. It was a very still day, but I knew it would be another half day before we reached Antarctica, and from there, we were planning to head west along the coast. I can remember it clearly, standing on the bow of the ship and looking out at the icebreaker some 500 meters in front of us. It got kind of tiring, staring out at the white and gray and blue beneath, but looking ahead of the icebreaker, I noticed a patch of ice that looked unusual. It was the same color as ice, but it looked smoother, more reflective somehow, like a hockey rink right after a Zamboni goes over it. The icebreaker paid it no mind, but when it hit that patch of ice, there was a deep moaning in the air, reverberating up through the water. I couldn't take my eyes off the icebreaker as the front half of it was lifted high into the air, before crashing back into the ocean with a massive splash. I saw what looked like the tail of a pale whale slipping underneath the ice. I could hardly believe my eyes, and I looked between the pieces of chipped ice in the water, trying to see it in the depths. I could just barely make it out, but there was definitely something there. It was difficult to get a sense of its size because I didn't know how far away it was, and it was definitely a pale color. I watched it fade deeper and deeper into the haze of the ocean, until finally I could see it no longer. Men came running and screaming out of the cabin of the icebreaker vessel, unsure of what they had hit or what was going on. I privately wondered what that whale had been doing in the ice. It definitely hadn't been moving when we first came upon it. Had the icebreaker freed it from the ice? How did it get trapped there? Could it really not get out on its own? We communicated over radio with the crew of the icebreaker to tell them what we had seen. It was a strange occurrence to be sure, but not one that was likely to continue to plague us. And yet, the crews of both vessels were on edge well into the night. In the morning, we arrived at the research base camp in Antarctica. The mood lightened up a bit as we all sat around and drank with some of the other researchers. The next day, we were out on snowmobiles, making our way west along the coast, measuring the depth of the ice at some of the penguin habitats, hanging out with the penguins. The babies were really cute. Little fluffy gray things. I was reminded why I chose this life as I watched them slide down the ice into the water, fishing. We weren't out there too long before there was a deep rumble coming off of the water a few kilometers out. I looked over at one of my lab mates, Millie, who had been stationed in Antarctica for the last 2 months. She looked back at me with her jaw hanging open, as though she knew what this was. I too recognized the sound. It was the sound of the whale from yesterday, but the fact that she seemed to recognize it and didn't know how to explain it scared me. That thing, that strange whale must live around here. The penguins started croaking, freaking out, flapping their flippers. Those that were in the water swam up and jumped out onto the ice. "What is that thing?" I asked Millie as I saw the white blob floating under the water, still very far away. And the fact that I could see it at all at this distance must have meant it was enormous. Millie wouldn't respond. She just kept looking nervously back between the water and me. "Is it a blue whale?" I asked her, trying to encourage her to say anything at all. "It's not a whale," she finally piped up dramatically. I looked back over the water to see the pale haze of the massive creature waiting by the bank of the ice. "Some of the Japanese researchers have a name for it," Millie continued sullenly. "They call it the Ningen, or the human." As she spoke those words, I noticed that the pale outline under the water did seem to have the shape of a human head, and long, pale arms. Looking at it now, I could tell that it was much larger than even a blue whale, maybe even twice the size. Penguins scurried about nervously on the ice. An overwhelming feeling of dread was building in my heart as I contemplated the size of the creature. Its head looked like it was floating face down, just staring into the depths of the water, so we couldn't see its face. "Are we safe here?" I asked nervously. We were pretty high up, 500 meters or so away from the ocean, on an ice shelf. I think so, Millie said nervously as she took a step back towards her snowmobile. It hasn't hurt any people, at least. Not so far. It eats penguins? I looked back at her, horrified. Yeah, she said with a sigh. Why haven't I heard about this? Why has no one reported it? You know, what would be the point? I was absolutely dumbfounded by this attitude, and somehow there was a deep calm in the air. The Ningen waited and waited and waited, and eventually the penguins just seemed to forget that it was there. 3 of them dove back into the water, and the Ningen waited. Another 5 dove back into the water, looking for fish. The Ningen waited. Another 16 penguins dove into the water, and the Ningen waited no longer. It scooped its monstrous head up to reveal a humanoid face, deep black eyes with no discernible whites, and a great, chasmous mouth that inhaled with a look of glee. Its monstrous arms scooped penguins up from both the water and from the ice shelf near it, and delivered the squawking birds to its own mouth. In one gulp, it must have swallowed about 30 penguins. Its large, dull eyes, which I could only make out thanks to its pale white skin, looked satisfied before it slinked away into the depths. I felt like I couldn't move after it left, and finally, Millie snapped me out of it. Let's get out of here. She sounded like she was about to cry. I couldn't blame her. When I got back to the station, all I wanted to talk about was what I had just seen, and everyone just had a sullen look on their face, like they'd seen it a million times and there was nothing they could do. We swapped stories, but all of them were kind of the same. The creature shows up, waits, eats penguins, and then leaves. They were half joking, but they told me that this Ningen contributes more to the loss of penguins than the loss of the ice does. But when they report the decline in penguin population, this thing doesn't get mentioned. When they first discovered it, the Ningen was reported, but it wasn't taken seriously by any government of any country. And as long as it wasn't a threat to humans, they had no choice but to just let it be. I really felt resentful as I went out to do my rounds the next day. Luckily, it was to a more inland penguin habitat, and I was very pleased not to run into that thing again. In fact, over the next couple weeks I was there, even though I kept dreading I would see it, I didn't, and that was a relief. The research vessel had been refueled and maintained, and it was time for me to go back to Argentina. Millie was coming back with me this time. She was very pleased to be getting off of that chunk of dirt and ice. Our vessel followed an icebreaker as usual, but we had only been traveling for 2 hours when that same dreadful groaning sounded in the Western Ocean, rumbling up through the ships and the water. Millie and I abandoned a card game we had been playing to run out on deck, but we couldn't see the outline of the Ningen under the water, and I don't know what caused it. But that same stillness filled the air again. I was leaning over the railing on the port side of the deck, searching for the creature in the depths, and suddenly something erupted at the front of the boat. A pair of massive, pale arms lifted into the air, each one towering at twice the height of our mast. The front of our boat was swept up in a wave, and I was flung overboard. The arms weren't after us, though. They reached down to grab the front and back of the icebreaker ship and snapped it in half. I could hear the muffled screaming of men from under the water, but below me I could see the body of this massive creature. I couldn't even see its tail. It was so far into the depths. Its human-like abdomen was only about 15 meters below me, and tracing it up, its arms were busily shoveling sailors into its hungry maw. I panicked and swam back to the surface as Millie threw out a lifesaver for me. I scrambled erratically to climb back up to the deck, but even when I did, I realized we were at the mercy of this thing. It dragged every last piece of the boat in front of us to the depths of the ocean, and for 5 minutes we sailed on in peace. But then came its terrible groaning again. I looked back out over the railing of the ship. I couldn't help myself, but this time I was more careful to make sure I had a solid grip. The pale back of the head of the Ningen floated up to the side of the boat. I felt certain that I was going to die, but there was no reason not to experience the moment fully. It made no difference whether or not I looked away, and I chose to watch. Seeing the way it allowed its humanoid arms to just float out beside it, elbows bent at 90 degrees, was so creepy. But even creepier was when it bent its head back 180 degrees to stare directly up at me. It felt like it was sucking my soul into the massive voids of its eyes. Its mouth was closed. It was smiling. Hey guys, thanks for listening to that story. I've really been enjoying some of these Japanese folklore monsters. Really creepy and imaginative. Subscribe and hit the bell for brand new original creepypastas every Thursdays, and tune in on Sunday nights at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for Nightmare Theater, an open book club for nightmares. Until next time, embrace the beautiful dark.